My name is Valerie. I am 32 years old, and I work as a folklore lecturer at a local university here in Louisiana. It was a Tuesday morning in late August, the kind of New Orleans day where the humidity is so thick and oppressive it feels like a wet wool blanket being pressed directly against your lungs the second you step outside. The heat radiating off the pavement was shimmering, but I honestly did not care. I felt absolutely invincible. I was walking into the local bank branch on Canal Street to finally, after a decade of scraping by, wire the down payment for my very first home. It was a gorgeous, weathered Creole cottage surrounded by ancient live oak trees draped in heavy Spanish moss. It was my dream. It was my independence. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank, and the freezing air conditioning instantly raised goosebumps on my bare arms. The lobby smelled distinctly of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and old paper. I walked straight up to the marble counter, my hands literally shaking with pure excitement, and greeted Miss Odette. She was a sweet, older teller I had known since I was a teenager. I slid the wire transfer paperwork across the cool marble surface and told her I was finally closing on the cottage. She smiled so warmly, her eyes crinkling behind her reading glasses, and congratulated me. She picked up my form, adjusted her glasses on her nose, and began typing away at her keyboard. I listened to the rhythmic clack of the keys, a sound I thought was building the foundation of my future. But then, the typing abruptly stopped. The warm smile completely vanished from Miss Odette's face. She leaned closer to her monitor, her brow furrowing into deep, worried lines. She hit a few more keys. The silence that stretched between us suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The hum of the building's air conditioner sounded deafening in my ears. When she finally looked up at me, her face had lost all its color. She lowered her voice to a fragile, shaky whisper and told me my father was here. She said Raymond came in right when the doors unlocked at 9 in the morning. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting away from mine, and told me the account was empty. I just stared at her. The words she was speaking simply did not compute in my brain. I asked her to refresh the screen. I told her there had to be a routing error, a glitch in the banking system, some kind of mistake. I had $120,000 in that account. I had checked the balance on my phone just last night before I went to sleep. Miss Odette slowly turned the monitor slightly so I could see the glowing green numbers for myself. The balance read exactly $14.22. She explained it to me very slowly, using a tone you would use with someone who had just been in a terrible car crash. The account was an old custodial setup. It was a standard joint checking account we opened together when I was 16 years old, right after I got my first summer job. Because I was a minor at the time, my father had to co-sign the paperwork. Over the years, I just kept using it. I trusted the man who raised me. It never crossed my mind to remove his name because I earned every single penny in it. But legally, Raymond had equal rights to it. He had walked in, signed a withdrawal slip, and walked out with my entire life savings in a cashier's check. My chest constricted so hard I thought my ribs were breaking. I turned around, pushed blindly through the glass doors, and stumbled out into the blistering heat. I barely made it to a decorative iron planter on the sidewalk before my knees buckled, and I threw up my morning coffee right into the dirt. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, ignoring the concerned and disgusted stares of the tourists walking past me on the sidewalk. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I dragged myself back to my old sedan. I got inside, locked the doors, and just sat there. The air conditioning in my car had been broken for 3 years, and the interior was baking in the late morning sun, blowing nothing but lukewarm, suffocating air into my face. Sweat dripped down my neck, mixing with tears I didn't even realize I was crying. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled out my phone and dialed my real estate agent. When she answered, her voice was cheerful, asking if the wire transfer went through smoothly. My voice cracked into a pathetic whimper as I tried to explain that there was a problem with the funds. The cheerfulness on her end vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, professional caution. She reminded me, in a very rigid tone, that we were already at the edge of our timeline. She told me I had exactly a 60-day grace period to cure any default on the contract, or I would permanently lose the property and forfeit my $5,000 earnest money deposit. I hung up the phone and dropped it onto the passenger seat. I didn't drive back to my cramped, dingy apartment in the city. I didn't drive to the university. I threw the car into drive, merged onto Interstate 10, and headed straight towards St. Martin Parish. It was a grueling 130-mile drive west, deep into the heart of the Bayou country. The highway stretched endlessly before me, elevated over the dark, murky waters of the basin. Usually, the sight of the dense cypress trees and the sprawling wetlands brought me a sense of peace, but today it just looked like an endless, swallowing grave. As the tires hummed a monotonous rhythm over the concrete, agonizing flashbacks hit me in relentless waves. I saw myself sitting at my tiny kitchen table at 3 a.m, my eyes burning as I graded a mountain of freshman essays just to earn a meager adjunct stipend. I saw the endless bowls of discount ramen noodles I ate for dinner, while my colleagues went out to nice restaurants. I remembered declining invitations to faculty dinners, missing out on weekend trips, and wearing the same 3 faded cardigans for 5 years straight. Every single sacrifice I had made over the last 10 years played on a loop in my mind. I had lived like a ghost, denying myself every basic comfort of my 20s, all to build a safety net so I would never have to depend on anyone. $120,000. It wasn't just cash. It was my youth. It was my security. It was the physical manifestation of my blood, sweat, and absolute isolation. And in a matter of 5 minutes, the man who was supposed to protect me had completely erased it. My breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. The heat inside the car was unbearable, but the cold, hard knot of betrayal forming in the pit of my stomach was infinitely worse. I pushed my foot down on the gas pedal, pushing my old car 10 miles over the speed limit. I needed answers. I needed to look my father in the eye. I pulled onto the familiar crushed gravel driveway of my childhood home. It was a pristine, sprawling raised house, elevated on heavy wooden pilings to survive the frequent coastal floods. It looked like a perfect southern postcard, complete with a wide wraparound porch and hanging ferns, but today I knew it was masking a rotting core. I threw the car into park and shoved the door open. My father, Raymond, was sitting in his favorite wicker rocking chair on the porch, holding a tall glass of iced tea. My mother, Sylvia, was sitting right next to him, casually flipping through a glossy lifestyle magazine. They looked so painfully, infuriatingly normal. They didn't look surprised to see me. They looked braced. I didn't have a clever speech prepared. I marched up the wooden steps, my shoes slamming against the floorboards, and I just fell apart. I screamed at him. It was a raw, guttural noise tearing out of my throat. I demanded to know where my money was, waving my phone with the banking app open like a weapon. Raymond didn't look ashamed. He didn't look guilty. He set his iced tea down on the side table with a slow, deliberate clink, smoothed his shirt, and looked at me with pure irritation. He told me to lower my voice because the neighbors could hear. I shrieked that I didn't care about the neighbors and told him he robbed me. Raymond crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, unapologetic line. He told me very calmly that he transferred the funds to my older brother, Preston. He said Preston needed immediate liquid capital to secure a prime commercial lease in the French Quarter for his new business venture, Crescent Heritage Tours. I asked him how he could steal my entire future so my 35-year-old brother could play businessman. Raymond raised his voice over my crying and called it a family tax. He looked me dead in the eye and said I was a single woman with a steady university job who had no dependents. He said I had no immediate need for a house, while Preston was trying to build a legacy that would generate real wealth for the entire family name. He called me selfish for hoarding cash. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, Sylvia closed her magazine and placed it on her lap. She used that soft, patronizing tone she always reserved for misbehaving children. She told me to stop being so dramatic. She looked at me with a chilling sense of entitlement and asked who paid for my braces when I was 12. She asked who kept a roof over my head during hurricane season and who bought my first beat-up car so I could commute to college. She weaponized every single act of basic parental care, turning my childhood into an itemized invoice. She told me I owed this family my support. They were gaslighting me right to my face. They were framing my hard-earned independence as an unpaid debt, expecting me to just smile and be a willing martyr for the golden child. I looked at the two people who were supposed to love me, and I saw absolute monsters. I couldn't breathe. I spun around, kicked a heavy terracotta potted plant off the edge of the porch, and sprinted back to my car. I tore out of the driveway, the tires spinning and kicking up a cloud of white gravel dust. I drove blindly for about 10 miles until the adrenaline burned out, leaving me shaking so violently I could hardly steer. I pulled over onto the grassy shoulder of a narrow parish road, right next to a murky, stagnant bayou. I put my head against the steering wheel and wept until my lungs physically ached. I raised my right hand and punched the hard plastic of the steering wheel. I hit it over and over again until the skin across my knuckles split open, and I could feel the warm, sticky slide of my own blood. Right then, my phone began to buzz in the cup holder. I lifted my head and stared at the screen. The caller ID displayed a single name, Preston. I wanted to throw the device straight into the swamp water, but a sick, desperate curiosity forced my hand. I pressed answer and held it to my ear. Preston didn't open the conversation with an apology. He spoke with the breezy, polished tone of a Silicon Valley CEO who was pitching a tech startup, completely ignoring the fact that his sister was bleeding and crying on the side of a road. He told me to calm down and stop using harsh words like theft. He smoothly reframed the entire nightmare as a temporary cash flow maneuver. He actually had the nerve to call my life savings a bridge loan. He spoke incredibly fast, using polished business jargon about foot traffic analytics, prime real estate in the French Quarter, and return on investment. He said the market was fiercely competitive and he needed the capital immediately. Then he offered me a concession. He promised to write up a contract giving me a pathetic 10% equity stake in his tour company. He spoke as if he were bestowing a grand, generous blessing upon me. He honestly believed he was doing me a favor by allowing my money to be activated by his vision. I gripped the phone, my bloody knuckles throbbing, and told him I didn't want equity. I told him I needed my $120,000 back right now because I was scheduled to close on my house. My voice wavered, sounding frantic and small. Preston sighed loudly, a sound thick with profound disappointment. And then, he deployed his ultimate weapon. He lowered his voice to a soft, intimate register and told me to remember the night Hurricane Ida made landfall years ago. He painted the picture vividly, how the roof tore off, how the drywall collapsed, and how he threw his body over mine to take the impact of the heavy plaster, suffering a concussion and 3 broken ribs to keep me safe. He reminded me of the blood on his forehead. He said he took the hit for me then, and now it was my turn to let him lead. He asked me to trust him. The psychological manipulation was flawless and paralyzing. He weaponized my deepest childhood gratitude to shut me up. The words tangled in my throat. I couldn't scream at him. I just let out a quiet, pathetic sob, hung up the phone, and sat there in the sweltering heat, feeling entirely isolated and trapped in a family dynamic that was designed to consume me. The immediate financial reality of my situation set in the moment I returned to my cramped apartment in New Orleans. I barely had time to wash the dried blood off my hands before there was a sharp knock at my door. It was my landlord. He didn't look happy. He handed me a crisp, formal letter and explained that the building had officially been sold to a commercial developer. They were clearing out all the current tenants to renovate the units into luxury condos. The letter stated I had exactly 14 days to vacate the premises. I stood in my tiny kitchen, staring at the eviction notice. A month ago, this wouldn't have been a crisis. I was supposed to be moving into my Creole cottage. Now, I had $14 in my bank account. I didn't have first month's rent, let alone a security deposit, to secure a new place to live. I was facing absolute, immediate ruin. Desperation breeds humiliation. I needed cash immediately just to buy groceries and keep my phone turned on. My university salary wouldn't hit for another 3 weeks. So I went online and begged for shifts at a local tourism agency I used to work for in my early 20s. By the weekend, I was wearing a cheap, itchy historical costume, holding a prop lantern and walking backward down the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter, giving late-night ghost tours to crowds of rowdy, half-drunk tourists. The pay was dismal, mostly relying on tips, but it kept me from starving. On my third night, a brutal, poetic cruelty slapped me right in the face. The pre-planned route for the ghost tour forced me to walk my group down Chartres Street. As I pointed my lantern toward a historic brick building to tell a story about a 19th-century haunting, my eyes caught a massive, professionally printed banner hanging over the newly polished double doors. It read, Crescent Heritage Tours, grand opening coming soon. It was Preston's building. It was the exact commercial lease he had secured using my stolen savings. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in off the Gulf, and the sky opened up, dumping heavy, freezing rain onto the streets. The tourists scattered to find shelter under the balcony overhangs. I just stood there in the pouring rain, my cheap costume clinging to my skin, my shoes rapidly filling with water. I stared at the beautiful, expensive facade of my brother's vanity project. I was literally standing in the gutter, humiliating myself for crumpled dollar bills, looking directly at the physical manifestation of my stolen future. The cold rain washed away the last lingering threads of my familial guilt. I realized then that my parents didn't just borrow from me, they had sacrificed me to the wolves so their son could play king. The next morning, I didn't bother changing out of my damp clothes. I got into my car and pointed my tires north toward Baton Rouge. I had exactly one option left, and it was a terrifying one. I was going to see my grandfather, Wallace. Wallace was an 82-year-old shipping magnate, a man carved directly from the harsh reality of the Mississippi River Delta. He built a highly profitable maritime logistics company from a single flatboat. He was ruthless in business and possessed a rigid, unforgiving moral compass. That compass was the exact reason he hadn't spoken a single word to my father in 10 years. A decade ago, Raymond had tried to leverage Wallace's company to fund a speculative, doomed offshore drilling venture. When it failed, Wallace cut him off entirely, banishing Raymond from his life and his ledger. Coming here was a desperate gamble. I fully expected my grandfather to look at me with weary eyes, deliver a harsh lecture about my foolishness for leaving a joint account open, and tell me to accept the loss to protect the family name. I walked up the creaking steps of his massive antebellum estate and was escorted into his back study. The room smelled of aged leather and damp earth. Wallace sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, looking like a stern riverboat captain. I sat down in the leather chair across from him, and the story just spilled out. I told him about the bank teller, the $14 balance, the confrontation on the porch, and the eviction notice currently sitting on my kitchen counter. Wallace didn't interrupt me once. He listened with a terrifying, unnatural stillness. When I finished, he stood up, walked to a side table, and poured 2 cups of pitch-black chicory coffee. He didn't offer milk or sugar. He slid a cup across the desk to me. The bitter taste was intentional, a physical manifestation of the harsh truth. He asked me for the exact date and the exact sum. I told him it was Tuesday, $120,000. Wallace didn't offer a comforting platitude. He didn't tell me everything would be okay. Instead, his piercing blue eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He reached across his desk, picked up his heavy black landline phone, and dialed a number from memory. A voice answered. Wallace spoke with the commanding grit of a man used to giving orders on a noisy shipping dock. He addressed the man as Harrison. Raymond just robbed the girl, Wallace growled into the receiver, his voice vibrating with a suppressed, calculated fury. He used a custodial loophole and took $120,000. I'm done waiting. Call everyone. Tonight. The forensic accountants. The private investigators. I want a war room set up in your office by midnight. He slammed the phone down and looked at me. He revealed that he had suspected Raymond of systematically siphoning a $300,000 generation skipping trust for the past decade, but he never had the proof to open an audit. My stolen money wasn't just a tragedy, it was the fatal mistake, the exact key they needed to pry open Raymond's buried finances and destroy him completely. If you are listening to this story and feeling the absolute rage of what Valerie is going through, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video to more people, and we truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the revenge. 2 weeks after the war room was established in Baton Rouge, Harrison informed me that a forensic audit of this magnitude was going to take time. We were looking at an 8-month legal siege before a judge would ever see a petition. I had to survive until then. To maintain appearances and gather any possible intelligence, I was obligated to attend a massive family crawfish boil in St. Martin Parish. It was a celebration for a cousin's newborn, and skipping it would only confirm the nasty rumors I knew were already swirling. I parked my car on the edge of a sprawling green lawn dotted with long folding tables covered in old newspaper. The loud roar of propane burners filled the humid afternoon air, and the sharp, stinging scent of boiling cayenne pepper and garlic burned my nose. I pasted a neutral, practiced smile on my face and walked toward the drink coolers. Before I could even grab a bottle of water, Aunt Beatrice intercepted me. Beatrice was my mother's oldest sister, a woman who treated local parish gossip as an Olympic sport. She stepped directly into my path, holding a red plastic cup of beer, her eyes scanning my tired face with unapologetic, cruel scrutiny. She didn't offer a hug or a greeting. She just clicked her tongue against her teeth and shook her head. She told me I needed to let go of my petty, childish grudges. She lowered her voice and said my mother, Sylvia, was sick with worry over my erratic, unstable behavior. Beatrice asked me how I could be so incredibly selfish when Preston was finally stepping up to restore the family name and bring prosperity to the household. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Raymond and Sylvia hadn't just stolen my money, they had preemptively launched a vicious smear campaign. They had told the entire extended family that I was hoarding cash, refusing to help the family during a tough season, and throwing a massive, jealous temper tantrum because Preston was securing a commercial lease in the French Quarter. They painted me as a bitter, crazy spinster to discredit any claims I might make about the theft. I stood frozen on the damp grass. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell everyone that Raymond forged his way into my life savings. But as I looked around, I saw dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins looking at me with varying shades of pity and disgust. They believed the lie. They preferred the comforting myth of the heroic son and the unstable daughter. The upbeat Zydeco music playing from the outdoor speakers warped into a dizzying, chaotic noise. My chest squeezed tight. I couldn't pull enough oxygen into my lungs. A full-blown panic attack crashed over me. I turned on my heel, knocked over a stack of paper napkins, and practically ran back to my car, leaving the whispers behind me. By late September, my reality had degraded into a grueling exercise in sheer endurance. I had officially been evicted and moved into a tiny, damp studio apartment on the neglected outskirts of the city. The roof leaked dirty water onto my floor every time it rained, and the window AC unit rattled incessantly. I was surviving on discount peanut butter and stale bread, completely exhausted from teaching classes all day and giving ghost tours all night. The legal war felt like an abstract concept that offered zero immediate caloric value. Then, on a Tuesday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Raymond's name. We hadn't spoken since the explosive confrontation on the porch. Against my better judgment, a dangerous flicker of curiosity forced me to answer. I braced myself for a barrage of insults, expecting him to yell about the preliminary bank subpoenas Harrison had quietly filed. Instead, the voice on the other end was shockingly calm. Raymond sounded weary, humbled, and surprisingly gentle. He took a slow, rattling breath and told me he had made a terrible mistake. He framed his theft as an act of desperate panic, claiming he was terrified of watching the family slide back into poverty. He admitted he was wrong to force me into funding Preston's commercial lease without my consent. The apology was incredibly disarming. It was the exact validation I had been craving for months. Then, Raymond lowered his voice to a conspiratorial tone. He begged me to call off Harrison and the forensic accountants. He said I didn't need to drag the family name through a messy public court battle because he had found a solution. He told me about a silent investor from Texas, an oil executive looking to diversify into cultural tourism who had supposedly agreed to buy a massive equity stake in Crescent Heritage Tours. Raymond swore the cash infusion was real. He promised the initial buy-in was more than enough to cover operational costs and refund my stolen money with interest. My heart kicked against my ribs. A dangerous, intoxicating surge of hope flooded my chest. Raymond swore on his life that he would wire the full $120,000 back into my account by Friday at noon. He told me I could still salvage my purchase of the Creole cottage if I just held off the lawyers for 3 more days. The emotional pull of a peaceful resolution, of getting my dream house back and ending the nightmare, was overpowering. I was too exhausted to fight a war if a treaty was on the table. I told him I needed the money by Friday noon. I hung up, opened my laptop, and sent an email to Harrison, instructing him to completely pause the aggressive document demands and hold off on the audit. I spent the next 3 days living in a state of agonizing, breathless anticipation. I mentally drafted the emails I would send to my real estate agent the moment the wire cleared. I let myself imagine sitting on the wide front porch of the Creole cottage, watching the herons fly over the water. The fantasy softened the sharp edges of my anger. Friday morning finally arrived. I woke up at dawn and logged into my banking app. The balance was still $14.22. I told myself wire transfers take time to process. I went to the university, graded a stack of folklore essays, and checked my phone every 15 minutes. Noon came and went. Nothing. By 3 o'clock, a cold, creeping dread settled deep into my stomach. I dialed Raymond's number. It went straight to voicemail. I called Preston. His phone rang endlessly. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, my laptop pinged with an email notification. It wasn't a wire transfer confirmation. It was a formal legal notice forwarded from my real estate agent. The email outlined the final, undeniable reality of my situation. The seller of the Creole cottage had officially terminated my purchase agreement due to my failure to cure the default within the 60-day grace period. The property was immediately being relisted on the open market, and my $5,000 earnest money deposit was legally forfeited. The words blurred on the screen. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. There was no silent investor from Texas. There was no equity buyout for Preston's company. The entire story was a diversionary bait. Raymond knew the exact timeline of my real estate contract. He knew the 60-day grace period expired on Friday at 5 o'clock. He also knew Harrison was tightening the legal noose with the subpoenas. Raymond needed to slow down the audit to buy himself time to hide his assets. But more importantly, he needed to ensure I permanently lost the cottage. He assumed that once the house was gone and the dream was fully shattered, I would be too demoralized, broken, and broke to continue fighting a costly legal battle. He weaponized my desperation for peace just to run out the clock on my legal deadline. The betrayal cut twice as deep as the initial theft. He had looked at my suffering and used it as a tool to execute me psychologically. I closed my laptop. The fleeting hope evaporated, leaving behind a hardened, unbreakable resolve. I picked up my phone and called Harrison. I told him the settlement offer was a fraudulent delaying tactic and instructed him to resume the strike with maximum force. But I needed money to drive to Baton Rouge the next morning to sign the new discovery authorizations. My bank account was empty. So, I walked out of my apartment, drove to a local medical clinic, and spent 2 hours with a needle in my arm, selling my blood plasma just to put enough gas in my tank to fuel my revenge. By late October, the relentless stress had physically altered me. The dark circles under my eyes looked like bruises, and my clothes hung loosely on my frame. I spent my evenings grading papers in a suffocating studio apartment that constantly smelled of mildew and wet dust, listening to the relentless drumming of the afternoon thunderstorms against my thin, single-pane windows. On a particularly miserable, rainy Thursday evening, a sharp knock at my door startled me. I wasn't expecting company. My new address was a secret I kept closely guarded from the parish gossip mill. I pulled my faded cardigan tight across my chest, shivering slightly, and peered through the scratched peephole. Preston was standing in the dimly lit hallway. He wore a crisp, tailored linen button-down shirt and expensive leather loafers. The juxtaposition of his polished, French Quarter success against the stained, peeling wallpaper of my apartment complex was jarring. He looked entirely out of place, like a wealthy tourist who had taken a wrong turn into a neglected neighborhood. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. I didn't invite him inside. I just stared at him and asked how he found me. Preston shifted his weight, resting his hand on the door frame. He told me he paid a small fee to a private investigator to run a utility check on my name. He pushed the door open a little wider, forcing his way into the small entryway. He opened his mouth to deliver what was likely a heavily rehearsed speech about family unity and his business growth, but the words completely died in his throat. His eyes scanned my tiny living space. He took in the brown water stains blooming across the ceiling. He saw the single battered mattress on the floor and the stack of cardboard boxes doubling as my dining table. He noticed the empty, barren kitchen shelves. The smug, confident aura of the golden child evaporated instantly. Seeing the visceral, undeniable reality of my poverty shattered his comfortable delusions. The horrific cost of his so-called bridge loan was no longer a theoretical concept discussed over sweet tea on our parents' porch. It was staring him right in the face. Preston looked physically ill. A deep flush of shame crept up his neck. He reached into the inner pocket of his linen shirt and pulled out a thick white envelope. His hands were actually trembling as he held it out to me. He stammered, tripping over his own words, and told me Crescent Heritage Tours had a spectacular opening month. He shoved the envelope toward my chest and said there was $2,000 in cash inside. He claimed it was his first dividend payout, and he wanted me to have it to get back on my feet. My pride demanded I slam the door in his face. I wanted to scream that $2,000 was a pathetic insult compared to the $120,000 they stole. But my electric bill was 10 days past due. Pride is a luxury reserved for people who know where their next meal is coming from. I snatched the envelope, closed the door, and sank to the floor. I ripped the paper open, and thick stacks of $20 and $50 bills spilled into my lap. I wept out of sheer, unadulterated humiliation. But as I smoothed out a stack of $50 bills to budget my utilities, a small, mundane detail caught my eye. The cash was secured by a faded paper currency band. I picked up the paper loop and examined the printed logo. It read, Iberia Parish Credit Union. I stared at the faded blue lettering, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. Preston lived in New Orleans. His Heritage Tourism Company was headquartered in the French Quarter. He banked with a massive national financial institution known for handling commercial accounts. There was absolutely zero logical reason for his business profits to be banded by a tiny, obscure rural credit union located 2 hours west of the city. A chilling realization washed over me. I recognized that logo. Iberia Parish Credit Union was the exact bank Raymond used decades ago to finance his ill-fated offshore ventures. It was the financial hub of my father's defunct maritime life. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a horrifying picture. Preston thought he was handing me a portion of his legitimate tourism profits. He didn't realize he was handing me a smoking gun. The funds were being commingled. The massive cash infusion Raymond stole from me wasn't just sitting in a clean escrow account for Crescent Heritage Tours. The money was being routed through my father's old regional bank accounts. Raymond was shuffling capital between new corporate ledgers and his own ancient, debt-ridden accounts to wash the money. This proved that the generation-skipping trust money Grandpa Wallace suspected was missing had likely followed the exact same labyrinthine path. My father was using the Rural Credit Union as a laundering station. I didn't have time to wait another 6 months for Harrison to slowly subpoena rural bank records through sluggish bureaucratic channels. I needed to hand the attorney undeniable proof of the commingled accounts to accelerate the forensic audit. I needed to take matters into my own hands, and I knew exactly when to do it. Sunday morning arrived with a blistering, humid heat that promised heavy afternoon thunderstorms. I knew the rhythm of my parents' lives with intimate precision. Every Sunday at 10 o'clock sharp, Raymond and Sylvia attended Mass at their local Catholic church in St. Martin Parish. It was an ironclad cultural routine they never broke, regardless of the weather or their personal crises. The service, followed by the customary social hour in the church courtyard, guaranteed their house would be entirely empty for at least 2 hours. I parked my sedan a quarter-mile down the parish road, keeping it hidden behind a dense thicket of tall sugar cane. I walked the rest of the way on foot, sweating through my dark cotton shirt. The air was thick and stagnant, filled with the deafening buzz of cicadas. I crept up the back steps of the raised house, carefully avoiding the loose wooden board I knew would creak. I didn't even need to pick a lock. I knew Raymond was a creature of paranoid habit. He never trusted digital cloud storage, and he always kept his most sensitive physical items nearby. I reached under the rim of a heavy wooden planter on the back porch and felt the small magnetic lockbox hidden out of sight. I popped it open, retrieved the spare brass key, and let myself in. The house was completely silent. The familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and chicory lingered in the stagnant air. My heart hammered against my ribs, pumping pure adrenaline through my veins. If they came home early, I was committing a felony. I moved quickly through the kitchen and down the hallway, heading straight for my father's study. The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the morning sun. I stepped behind his large oak desk. I pulled open the bottom right drawer. It was locked. I reached under the lip of the desk and found another tiny silver key taped to the wood. I unlocked the drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. I opened the heavy cover and flipped through the pages. The columns were filled with neat, precise handwriting detailing years of illicit financial maneuvering. My breath hitched in my throat. There were transfer records from Wallace's Generation Skipping Trust routed directly into the Iberia Parish Credit Union. There were notations of back taxes paid to the federal government using funds explicitly labeled as commercial lease deposits. And most damning of all, there were dozens of payments made to a limited liability company called Bayou Marine Maintenance. The entire fraudulent anatomy of my family was mapped out right there in black ink. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were slick with sweat. I turned on the camera and began snapping high-resolution photographs of every single page. The digital shutter clicked in rapid succession, echoing loudly in the silent study. I photographed the routing numbers, the hidden shell company names, and the forged signature logs. I spent 20 terrifying minutes capturing a decade of absolute theft. I closed the ledger, locked the drawer, and returned the silver key to its hiding spot. I slipped out the back door, locking it behind me, and returned the spare key to the magnetic box just as the distant chime of the church bells signaled the end of the morning service. I walked back to my hidden car, the suffocating heat pressing down on my shoulders. The crushing shame I felt when Preston handed me that envelope was entirely gone. I patted the phone in my pocket, feeling the undeniable weight of the evidence. I was ready to unleash hell. The drive to Baton Rouge felt entirely different this time. The polished gray marble of Harrison's law firm no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a war room, and I was bringing the ammunition. I stepped out of the elevator and marched straight into the main conference room. Grandpa Wallace was already there, sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table. A new figure sat beside Harrison. She was a forensic accountant named Monica. Her desk was covered in thick binders, printed spreadsheets, and sprawling whiteboards marked with red lines mapping out complex financial routing numbers. Harrison instructed me to sit down and directed my attention to a massive projection screen at the end of the room. Monica stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her gray blazer. She picked up a laser pointer and clicked it on. A bright green dot danced across a dense spreadsheet projected on the wall. She told me the photographs of the Iberia Parish Credit Union ledgers cracked the entire facade wide open. They provided the exact account routing numbers she needed to subpoena the hidden bank records without triggering a protracted legal fight over jurisdiction. She turned to face my grandfather. Her voice was devoid of emotion, delivering the forensic autopsy of my family's finances with clinical, brutal precision. She told Wallace the theft was not a recent act of desperation. It was a systematic, decade-long plundering operation. The truth was infinitely more sinister than we initially suspected. Raymond and Sylvia didn't just drain my $120,000 joint account. Over the past 10 years, my parents illegally siphoned exactly $300,000 from the generation-skipping trust Wallace had established. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold numbness spread outward from my chest. $300,000. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. Monica clicked the remote to the next slide. A complex flowchart appeared. Raymond knew he couldn't simply wire money from the trust directly into his personal checking account without drawing the attention of the Internal Revenue Service. So, he created a phantom corporate entity. He established a shell company called Bayou Marine Maintenance. On paper, it appeared to be a legitimate local vendor specializing in repairing commercial boats. In reality, it possessed no physical address, no employees, and zero clients. Raymond spent the last 10 years submitting forged invoices to the trust, billing the fund for fictitious repairs. He then routed the cash through the Rural Credit Union, washing the money clean before depositing it into his personal accounts. Monica explained exactly where the money went. My parents used the stolen inheritance to maintain the illusion of their comfortable, country club lifestyle. They bought new vehicles, upgraded their home, and went on vacations they couldn't afford. But the most infuriating revelation was the funding of Preston's endless string of doomed startups. The forensic accountant traced over $100,000 funneled directly into my brother's past failures, the ill-fated craft brewery, the defunct Swamp Turboat Company, the collapsed real estate flipping venture. Every single arrogant misstep Preston made over the last decade was secretly underwritten by the very trust fund designed to guarantee my financial security. Harrison stepped forward, turning on the fluorescent lights. He looked at me and said the legal trap was now perfectly constructed. The paper trail was irrefutable. We possessed the forged compliance waivers, the shell company routing numbers, and the exact dates of the illegal transfers. It was time to file the petition and depose my father. 3 weeks later, the relentless machinery of the legal system pulled us all into a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Baton Rouge for the official deposition. The transition from the chaotic, vibrant streets of New Orleans to this cold, unforgiving environment was intense. The room was illuminated by harsh overhead lights that cast deep shadows across the faces of everyone sitting at the long polished table. The only sound was the quiet, steady clack of the court reporter's fingers moving across her stenography machine, capturing every single spoken syllable for the official legal record. I sat next to Harrison, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the table sat my father. Raymond looked like a ghost of the arrogant patriarch who had yelled at me on his porch just a few months ago. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. His skin was pale, and a thin layer of sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chilling air conditioning. He sat beside his own defense attorney, a frantic-looking man who had clearly run out of options. A deposition is a brutal process. It strips away all the comforting myths and defensive posturing a person uses to survive their own guilt. There is no room for grand emotional speeches. There are only direct questions demanding direct answers under the strict penalty of perjury. Harrison began the interrogation with surgical precision. He didn't raise his voice. He simply opened a thick binder and handed my father copies of the forged compliance waivers. He presented the routing numbers for the fake boat maintenance company. Raymond was forced to answer. The answers came out in short, clipped, fragmented sentences. Yes, that is my signature. Yes, I transferred those funds. Yes, I created that corporate entity. With every admission, the towering legend of the self-made Louisiana businessman chipped away, leaving behind nothing but a frightened thief. Then, Harrison turned the page. The line of questioning shifted away from the ancient trust fund and focused directly on the $120,000 stolen from my checking account. Harrison looked at my father and asked him to explain the logic behind the withdrawal. He asked Raymond why he felt legally and morally entitled to confiscate funds entirely generated by his daughter's employment. Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The flush of humiliation crawled up his neck. Cornered and stripped of his usual defenses, my father resorted to the ugly, archaic worldview that governed his entire life. He leaned forward and spoke his twisted truth directly into the microphone. He stated that I was an unmarried woman with a teaching salary. He said that a single woman did not require large sums of liquid capital because she had no dependents to feed and no legacy to build. He claimed that a husband would eventually step in to provide for my financial needs, rendering my personal savings excessive and unnecessary. He then contrasted my life with my brother's future. He declared that a son carries the family name. A son requires seed money to build a business and restore the household honor. He looked right at me, his eyes narrowing with bitter judgment, and stated that taking the money was the correct decision for the survival of our lineage. The raw, casual misogyny hung in the freezing air. I spent my career teaching young women about historical oppression, and here was my own father, on the official legal record, reducing my entire existence to a useless incubator waiting for a husband. He didn't view me as an autonomous human being. He viewed my life and my hard work as communal property waiting to be harvested for the benefit of his male heir. Harrison didn't flinch. He simply nodded, let the stenographer record every sickening word, and turned to the next page in his binder. Harrison pulled a copy of a commercial lease agreement from his files. He slid the document across the table, tapping his expensive pen against a specific highlighted paragraph. It was the finalized rental contract for Crescent Heritage Tours, the exact French Quarter venue Preston had leased. Harrison asked Raymond to read the required security deposit amount listed on the lease. My father stared at the document. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper as he read the figure. $40,000. Harrison leaned back in his chair, bridging his fingers together. He looked at my father with eyes as cold as black ice. He stated the mathematical discrepancy plainly. You withdrew $120,000 from your daughter's checking account. The commercial lease for your son's business only required $40,000. Where's the remaining $80,000? The color drained entirely from Raymond's face. He looked at his defense lawyer, sheer panic vibrating in his eyes. He stammered, offering a weak, pathetic excuse about operational overhead and marketing budgets for Preston's company. Harrison cut him off immediately. He reminded Raymond that he was under oath and that perjury carried severe criminal penalties. Harrison informed my father that he already possessed the bank routing numbers for the missing $80,000, but he wanted the explanation stated clearly for the record. The silence in the room became agonizing. The court reporter waited, her hands hovering over the keys. Raymond slumped forward. The arrogant pride, the unyielding defiance, the self-righteous justification, all of it disintegrated into dust. He looked like a small, broken, terrified old man. He stared down at his trembling hands and whispered the answer into the microphone. The Internal Revenue Service. A shockwave of stunned realization washed over me. Harrison pressed him to elaborate, demanding the full context of the payment. My father confessed the ultimate buried secret. My parents were not just struggling to maintain their lifestyle. They were absolutely destitute. Raymond had failed to pay the federal property taxes on their sprawling, raised home in St. Martin Parish for 3 consecutive years. The IRS had grown tired of the delays and issued a final notice of intent to levy. If my father did not hand over $55,000 in delinquent taxes by the end of August, the federal government was going to seize the property, auction it off, and leave my parents homeless. He used an additional $25,000 to secretly pay off Preston's maxed-out credit cards and buy a used commercial van to keep up the illusion of business growth. The truth laid out on the conference table completely rewrote the entire narrative of the theft. The grand, misogynistic story about funding Preston's heritage tourism business to build a male legacy was a convenient lie. It was a desperate smokescreen used to justify the robbery. The primary motivation was sheer, terrified survival. Raymond stole my life savings to pay off the federal government and keep a roof over his own head. Harrison asked if Preston was aware of the impending IRS seizure. Raymond shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. He admitted his son knew nothing about the tax liens. Preston honestly believed the entire sum went into his corporate escrow account. My brother was a clueless pawn used by his own father to cover up a catastrophic financial failure. The curated image of Southern wealth was a fabricated hallucination sustained by stolen money and a desperate fear of the truth. Harrison stated he had no further questions at this time and requested a short 10-minute recess before reviewing the next batch of exhibits. The court reporters stopped typing. I pushed my chair back and stood up on shaky legs. The revelations of the last hour made the sterile air feel heavy and impossible to breathe. I needed a moment alone to process the horrifying reality that my entire life had been shaped by a bankrupt lie. I walked out of the conference room and headed down the long, quiet hallway toward the restroom. I pushed through the heavy wooden door. The space was quiet, lined with pale green tiles and a row of large mirrors hanging above the sinks. I walked over to the nearest basin, turned on the cold water, and splashed it across my face. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, taking deep breaths, staring at my pale reflection. The heavy wooden door creaked open behind me. I looked up into the mirror. My mother stood in the doorway. Sylvia looked like a shadow of the vibrant woman who usually held court at family gatherings. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her dark dress seemed to swallow her small frame. The haughty, judgmental aura she carried on the porch was completely gone. She looked terrified. She closed the door softly behind her. She took 2 steps toward me, and then her knees simply buckled. She collapsed under the crushing weight of the deposition, sliding down the pale green tiled wall until she hit the floor. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep. It was a raw, ugly, guttural wail. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire life disintegrate into ash. I turned around slowly, my back pressing against the cold sink. I looked down at the woman who raised me. I didn't offer a comforting word. I just waited. Sylvia raised her head, her face streaked with running mascara. She reached out with a trembling hand, grasping my wrist. She started to speak, her voice shaking so hard the words tangled together. She confessed the depth of the nightmare they had been living, the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, terrified of the impending IRS seizure. But then, she offered an explanation for why they chose to sacrifice me instead of Preston. She tightened her grip on my wrist and lowered her voice to a hoarse whisper, attempting to offer what she genuinely believed was a profound compliment. She told me I was resilient. She said I was built from tougher material than my older brother. She reminded me of how I scraped my way through graduate school, surviving on almost nothing. She said I knew how to navigate the hard edges of the world. Then she talked about Preston. She said my brother was fragile beneath his arrogant exterior. She confessed that Preston possessed a delicate, easily shattered ego, and if he realized the family was entirely destitute, the shame of poverty would literally destroy him. Sylvia looked at me with a twisted, desperate sincerity and admitted she sacrificed my future because she knew I was strong enough to rebuild it, and she knew Preston would drown without a life vest. The toxic compliment hung in the quiet air of the restroom. The sheer, staggering dysfunction of her logic paralyzed me. She loved me, but she loved me for my ability to endure suffering. She viewed my resilience as a renewable resource, a communal asset she could harvest to protect her fragile golden child. A profound, clarifying sorrow washed over me. I realized in that exact moment that this family dynamic was a terminal illness. I gently pulled my wrist out of her grasp. I looked at the weeping, broken woman sitting on the floor, and I spoke in a quiet, steady voice. I forgive you for being terrified, I told her. But my resilience is no longer yours to spend. I am done surviving the ruins of your bad decisions. I turned my back on my mother, walked out the heavy wooden door, and didn't look back. The following Saturday evening, the French Quarter pulsed with a vibrant, chaotic energy. The humid air was thick with the scent of fried seafood, stale beer, and blooming magnolia. Gas lamps flickered along the wrought iron balconies, casting long dancing shadows across the cobblestone streets. Preston had spared absolutely no expense for the grand opening gala of Crescent Heritage Tours. He rented the second floor of a historic brick building overlooking Jackson Square. A traditional brass band played upbeat jazz in the corner. Waiters in crisp white aprons circulated through the crowd of local politicians and wealthy business owners, carrying silver trays loaded with crab cakes and crystal flutes of champagne. Preston stood near the center of the room in a sharp navy suit, laughing loudly and playing the successful young entrepreneur to perfection. Across the room, Raymond and Sylvia held court near the main bar. My parents looked radiant. The devastating failure of the deposition, the crushing reality of the IRS liens, all of it seemed temporarily erased by the glittering success of the evening. They looked like royalty presiding over a newly conquered kingdom. Every guest in the room was drinking stolen champagne. Everything was funded by my stolen $120,000 and the plundered remnants of my grandfather's trust fund. The attendees smiled and clapped, entirely unaware that they were standing in a house of cards held together by forged signatures. At 8 o'clock, Preston walked up to a small wooden stage at the front of the room. The lively chatter faded. He smiled warmly, thanking everyone for their support, and then invited our father to the stage. Raymond walked up the wooden steps, taking the microphone. He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes shining with undeniable triumph. He cleared his throat and delivered a toast. He spoke in deep, resonant tones, weaving a narrative of pure fiction. He bragged about the unyielding spirit of Louisiana resilience. He puffed his chest out and declared that our family rebuilt their legacy through sheer grit and hard work. He raised his glass of bourbon high into the air and loudly proclaimed that his son built this incredible company without taking a single handout from anyone. The staggering hypocrisy hung in the air. He was demanding applause for self-reliance while standing on a stage paid for by my eviction. The crowd raised their glasses, cheering for the triumphant patriarch. But near the back of the room, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a nondescript gray suit decided he had heard enough. The process server stepped out from behind a towering indoor fern and walked directly toward the stage. He moved with swift, unyielding momentum, cutting through the crowd. He climbed the 3 short steps onto the stage, walking right up to my father. He pulled a thick manila envelope from under his arm. He spoke loudly, projecting his voice over the murmuring crowd so the front row of guests could hear every single word. He identified Raymond by his full legal name and stated he was serving formal legal notice of a civil petition filed in the district court. He thrust the thick stack of papers directly into my father's chest. Raymond stumbled backward, dropping his glass of bourbon. It shattered on the stage. The microphone feedback whined, a sharp, ear-piercing squeal echoing through the sudden dead silence of the ballroom. The bold black text on the front page listed the charges: gross fiduciary fraud, forgery, breach of trust. Sylvia, standing near the edge of the stage, saw the words. The horrific reality slammed into her. She let out a short, gasping breath, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fainted, collapsing onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. Chaos erupted. Preston dropped to his knees, his face draining of all color, screaming for an ambulance. I was not there to witness this spectacular downfall. I sat alone in my dark, damp apartment, staring at the blank screen of my television, listening to the rain tap against my windows. My phone buzzed with a text from Harrison confirming delivery. The execution was complete. 3 weeks after the disastrous gala, the legal hammer fell with absolute, crushing finality. Facing the undeniable threat of severe criminal felony charges for forgery and fraud, Raymond's defense attorney advised him to surrender completely. My father signed a total financial liquidation settlement. The terms were brutal but necessary. My parents were forced to immediately list their sprawling, raised home in St. Martin Parish for sale, using the proceeds to satisfy the $55,000 federal tax lien and pay off the remaining balance to the trust. They surrendered their vehicles, liquidated their meager retirement accounts, and relinquished all future claims to any portion of the family estate. But the most devastating blow was reserved for Preston. Because my stolen $120,000 was directly traced into his commercial lease escrow and business accounts, the court placed a hard lien on Crescent Heritage Tours. The business accounts were frozen instantly. Preston couldn't pay his tour guides, his advertising vendors, or even the electric bill for the French Quarter venue. The company was paralyzed before the winter tourism season even began. The settlement required the immediate liquidation of his company to recover the stolen capital. 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, Grandpa Wallace executed his final strategic move. He officially transferred the managing trustee powers of the Generation Skipping Trust over to me. I was no longer a victim waiting for a payout. I possessed the legal authority to manage the recovered assets. As Preston's company entered forced liquidation, the commercial lease and the physical assets, including the prime French Quarter office space, the custom-built tour boats, and the marketing infrastructure, were put up for auction to satisfy the outstanding debts. I didn't let those assets disappear into the anonymous hands of a commercial bank. I used the recovered capital within the trust to purchase the liquidated assets of Crescent Heritage Tours for pennies on the dollar. The transaction was flawlessly executed, entirely legal, and utterly devastating. I legally assumed total ownership of the exact company my brother built using the money he stole from my future. The day the transfer of ownership was finalized, I drove into the French Quarter. I walked up the velvet-lined stairs of the venue overlooking Jackson Square. Preston was sitting behind the large oak desk in the main office, packing his personal belongings into a cardboard box. He looked up when I walked through the door. His face was a mask of bitter, exhausted defeat. He didn't try to offer a slick business pitch or deploy his golden child charm. He simply stared at me, clutching a framed photograph. I didn't scream at him. I didn't deliver a dramatic monologue about vengeance. I stood in the doorway, holding the folder containing the finalized ownership deeds, and spoke with cool, measured professionalism. I told my brother that, effective immediately, his services as the managing director of Crescent Heritage Tours were no longer required. I fired him from his own company. Preston swallowed hard. He didn't argue. He placed the photograph into his box, picked it up, and walked past me toward the exit. He stopped for a brief second in the doorway, his shoulders slumped under the heavy, undeniable weight of his own failure. He whispered a quiet, broken apology and walked down the stairs, leaving the building for good. 1 full year passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Baton Rouge courthouse closed behind me for the final time. The suffocating Louisiana heat yielded to a crisp autumn, bled into a mild winter, and eventually blossomed into a vibrant spring. My daily existence no longer revolved around frantic survival math or the terrifying threat of eviction. The justice I secured was cold and absolute, but I was not interested in managing a commercial tourism trap. My passion was folklore and academic preservation. The very next morning after I fired my brother, I legally restructured Crescent Heritage Tours. I transferred the assets into a nonprofit educational trust and handed operational control over to my university's folklore department. We transformed my brother's stolen vanity project into a massive, fully funded academic program offering paid internships and hands-on historical preservation training for marginalized local youth. I took the exact weapon my family used to destroy my independence and reforged it into my own academic legacy. The university administration rewarded my initiative by officially placing me on the tenure track. I also finally purchased a Creole cottage. It wasn't the exact same property I lost during the initial theft, but it was infinitely better, sitting on a quiet parish road lined with ancient live oaks. I built my new reality on unyielding ground, and I protected it by enforcing ruthless, permanent boundaries. I maintained a strict no-contact policy with my parents and my brother. Preston experienced a harsh collision with reality. Stripped of his tailored suits and his secret trust fund, the golden child was forced to join the working class. He now tends bar at a crowded, noisy tavern on Bourbon Street, pouring cheap draft beer for rowdy tourists and cleaning sticky floors until 3 in the morning. But the most striking measure of poetic justice happened on a muddy wooden dock in the deep southern edge of the parish. A few weeks ago, I drove down to the coastal wharfs to purchase fresh seafood for a faculty dinner. The morning fog was just lifting off the gray water. I glanced down the wooden pier and saw a weathered, aging man struggling to haul a heavy wire oyster trap out of the murky water. He wore thick rubber boots stained with mud and a faded canvas jacket. His shoulders were hunched, his movement slow and agonizing under the strain of the heavy manual labor. It was Raymond. My father was working as a deckhand. His sprawling raised home was gone, auctioned off to satisfy the staggering federal tax liens. But the true devastating poetry of his situation lay in the painted name on the side of the fishing vessel. The boat belonged to a man named Thibodeau. A decade ago, when my father was parading around pretending to be a wealthy consultant, he mercilessly mocked Thibodeau, calling him a low-class swamp rat. Now, Raymond was on Thibodeau's payroll, earning minimum wage, taking orders from the exact man he used to despise. Raymond looked up from his grueling task and saw me standing on the dock. He froze. The heavy wire trap slipped from his grip and splashed back into the shallow water. By desperately stealing from his children to avoid becoming a poor deckhand, he guaranteed that exact fate. I didn't wave. I didn't gloat. I simply acknowledged the harsh, undeniable reality of his choices, turned away, and left him standing in the cold morning mud. Later that afternoon, I returned to my Creole cottage. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the wooden porch planks. Grandpa Wallace was already sitting in a wicker rocking chair, waiting for me. I carried a white paper bag out onto the porch and sat down next to him. I didn't brew bitter chicory coffee today. The time for harsh wakefulness was over. Instead, I pulled out 2 warm, fresh beignets. I handed one to Wallace, the sweet powdered sugar drifting down onto our laps like soft winter snow. We sat in a comfortable, easy silence, watching the fireflies blink in the humid twilight. I lost my nuclear family, but I bought back my autonomy. I learned that enforcing ironclad boundaries is not a cruel act of vengeance, but a necessary act of profound self-preservation. My family accused me of being ruthless for stripping them of everything they owned, tearing apart our legacy just to get my money back. But they were willing to let me lose everything to save themselves. Am I wrong for enforcing justice? Should I have let it go to keep the family together, or should I ever accept my brother's apologies? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button to join our community and hear more incredible stories. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them.